My name is Hannah. I am a queer woman who's currently living in central, semi-rural Vermont, went to high school in rural Vermont, and grew up in, small rural schools in communities in Vermont. And I'm also coming to this with my lived experience and also as a student of education of right now of early childhood education, really wanting to address that like piece that even if LGBT, education happens, it doesn't happen until high school. And there's this stigma around, oh, LGBT identities are inherently sexual, they're inappropriate, we can't talk about that with children, we can't recognize that at all, even when there are queer and trans students and children in the room. It's never, and it's getting a little bit better, but there's definitely still those really horrible negative ideas. So as an educator, I want to strive to, make my classrooms as inclusive as possible, including LGBT identities and stories, suited, and work in, in a in a blah. I'll stumble over my words a lot, but at a developmentally appropriate level, because children, I worked with 3 and 4 year olds, and they're incredibly intelligent, empathetic, and they're absolutely capable of understanding, LGBT identities, families, experiences, and it's really important for them to have that knowledge, because some of them may end up identifying as LGBT themselves, encounter LGBT families in their communities, teachers, and staff members. So I think it's really important to start that as early as possible.
Thank you.
Mm.
All right. So now I'll start asking some of the more general questions first. The first one I want to ask is, what do queer and trans kids and youth need from their communities?
Oh gosh. I think definitely first of all just awareness that they exist, and not just awareness but acceptance that they exist in all of their multitude of identities. And also, oh gosh, I'm going to stumble over my words a lot,
All good.
but just it's space to explore, also space to explore identities for to try on identities and labels, because and the not resources to learn about different identities. Think a lot, for example, sex education, as non-existent as it often is even more non-existent for LGBT youth. And especially, I think my sex education was, the school doesn't want you to have sex, so we're just not going to talk about it, basically. And that's harmful to all youth, and especially harmful to LGBT youth who won't see themselves represented in the classroom and in the curriculum. So definitely space and time and resources, and also just access to supportive adults, and especially supportive adults who identify as queer, and really the ability to see themselves, because a big issue is the ability to see themselves and envision themselves as adults, and that they can have really full, rich lives as queer adults. So those positive role models are also incredibly important.
We've had a lot of people bring that up, and I just think it is really important to have, like, yeah, being able to see, like, queer and trans adults will, like, help you
Mm-hmm.
be able to envision your future. And I think that was something that I didn't have
Mm-hmm.
enough of. I wasn't really, like, the only queer people I knew were my age, were struggling with a lot of the same things that I was, and I didn't really see, like, what was the future for me, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's so hard to envision what your future is when everyone in your, that you're surrounded by, you're all, 16 years old. You have no idea what's going to happen in the future, and there's no kind of a guiding, adult guiding. I don't know if guidepost is the right word, but like guiding figure to let you know that it's all going to be okay, that you're going to grow up, that you're, if you're in a bad situation, that you will be able to escape from it and be fully who you are and be accepted.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really important. So I also wanted to ask, what do queer and trans kids and youth bring to their communities?
Oh gosh, so many things. Just their amazing, it's all just their amazing sense of community and their ability to come together to support their peers. Just their abilities to break down boundaries. I've heard some folks I think it was on a trip I was on last year, refer to use queer as a verb, meaning to, break down boundaries and break down our expectations, and to really, so just that ability to just to re-envision, you know that what things can be, what relationships can be, what, subvert expectations, is really incredible. Also, and just their strength to both, I don't like to center the LGBT community on tragedy, because I feel like that is a thing that happens a lot. But I think just their ability to go through everything that they go through and to come out on the other side with so much strength.
Yeah. No, definitely. Oh. Yeah, there are a lot of different strengths that
Mm-hmm.
queer people have, I really like that this was one of the questions that we were
Mm-hmm.
asking, because I feel like it's also important to focus on like what we bring to
Mm-hmm.
our communities.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's that we're not just tragedy, and we're not just struggle.
Yeah.
But we have some amazing things to offer also.
Yeah, definitely. So, what would you say to well meaning adults in the community who are new to thinking about gender and sexuality and aren't sure what to do or say?
Um, I say, first of all, just be open to listening to youth, and really, put aside your own. You may have like preconceived notions or ideas, and you may be well-meaning, but I think really the first thing to do is just to put aside your own preconceived ideas and biases and assumptions, and really listen to what youth are telling you that they need, and what their struggles are, and what their identities mean to them. Because I think there's a lot of, in our culture, it's really hard for older folks to listen to youth and to listen to children, and to really like put their own biases aside, and to like fully understand and accept, what young adults and youth tell adults about themselves and their experiences. So first of all, just to listen, and to take, you know, their experience, believe their experiences and take their experiences at face value. And yeah, I think that's my biggest thing. And just be open also to, ideas about gender and sexuality change really fast. And they have, even if you are an older adult who may identify as queer, there may be different ideas that young people have that you may not have had or known about when you were young, which I think is also where there's some, there's where a lot of conflict in the community comes from. But so definitely just to be open-minded to new ideas.
Yeah, listening is really important.
Hmm.
It's always important. Yeah, and I know I think yeah, no, you do have like a good like perspective like with your experience with kids. Like I know you were saying earlier, like kids are smart, kids are
Hmm.
empathetic. Like, they are underestimated a lot.
Hmm. They really are.
Hmm.
Yeah, no, I think one of my least favorite phrases is, "Oh, they're too young to understand that." Like, no, they're not.
Hmm.
They're not too young. You just have to explain it to them in a developmentally appropriate way,
Yeah.
and they'll understand it.
Hmm. Definitely. So I do want to talk about media representation next. So where do you see positive queer and trans representation in TV and film?
Um, definitely, I actually wrote down I wrote down a lot of them. I put Love Victor at the top of the list. It's the first it's a one season show on Hulu that comes post Love, Simon, which is another movie I have on my list. It was created to address a lot of the issues that people brought up with Love, Simon, with the fact that the story was centered on a, white, fairly affluent cis boy. So there's some really incredible like Latinx representation in Love, Victor, and it's also just a lot more. It's realistic without being excessively tragic. That
Yeah.
you do get the idea that there could be a happy ending, and it's not all tragedy, but there's a lot of really realistic, struggle as the main character tries to figure out his sexuality and who is he attracted to, and he thinks he could be attracted to girls, and I just think it's a really incredible and also just really sweet series. And I think that's really important. And then what else did I have in here? I had some more like cartoon shows like Legend of Korra and Steven Universe. I had Sex Education, which is a British show on Netflix that addresses a lot of different queer identities and queer struggles, and has some asexual and pansexual representation. And I think that's a really, really wonderful show. And I had Moonlight, I think there is an element of tragedy there, but I think it's really important that it shows a queer Black story, which is really important to have that intersectionality also of race and sexuality. And one more that I had was it's older, it's probably really problematic, but The Barricade with Robin Williams is a movie that I really love it. It's about Robin Williams plays a gay man who owns a drag club where drag like a queer club where drag queens perform. And it's a comedy, and it's a lot older. There's probably problematic elements, but I just love the fact that it's a comedy at its core.
Yeah. No, I know we've talked about Love, Victor, and I love that
Yes.
show too. There's just so many different things about it that
Mhm.
are really good. But yeah, and I think that's actually a good one to bring up because it is centered around youth.
Mhm.
And it's something that like people could definitely watch and relate to, like young people.
Exactly. Exactly. And just a kind of happy, goofy, kind of goofy show that I think that young people deserve and that young queer people deserve, because so many of our narratives are really tragic, and there's a lot of pain and a lot of trauma that happens in them. So to see and have access to just happy media with happy, joyful representation of queer youth and queer identities is so important.
Yeah. Actually, I think there might be a season 2 at some point.
They renewed a season 2, but COVID and
They
filming.
did, yeah, but we don't know. There are a lot of things that got renewed that we don't know when they're happening.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
I really appreciate how you're talking about these representations in terms of what might queer kids and youth want to see,
Mhm. Yeah.
not only what might adults want to see about queer
Mhm.
and trans characters, right?
Exactly.
And a lot of times the answer is the same. Like
Mhm.
straight cis adults who want to be looking at positive representations could look at all
Mhm.
the same things, including the animated ones, right?
Exactly.
But it just occurred to me while you were talking how it's so important that we remember that these shows are created for entertainment,
Mhm.
and not for making realistic representations, right? They're not
Yeah,
supposed to be
definitely.
realistic. They're not realistic straight cis people either.
Exactly.
So what I wouldn't want is for someone to, go to
Yeah.
their niece or nephew and be like, I watched Steven Universe and now I totally understand your
Ex-
community and your experience, right? Like not quite that direct,
Not really.
but still maybe you should go watch Steven Universe.
Exactly.
I also wanted to ask where you see positive representations of queer and trans people in kids and youth books.
Ooh, that is something I'm really interested in kids fiction, especially as someone who's going to be a teacher. I see a lot of So when I was like doing research and researching different books, there's a lot of picture books that have come out recently, which is great to explain, queer identities and experiences to younger kids. And then there's a lot of YA LGBT fiction, which is also really great. And then in the middle, there's a little bit of it feels like there's a dearth of like upper elementary, lower middle school LGBT representation. So a lot of what I have is I have a lot of picture books. I have like And Tango Makes Three is one that I really love. It's about the two male penguins in hatching an egg in the Central Park Zoo. I also really like Julian is a Mermaid, which also it has some Latinx representation, also representation of the gender presentation and the fluidity of gender identity. Heather Has Two Mommies is one that was recent. It's an older book that was I believe it was kind of republished recently. That's a really lovely one to talk about, LGBT families and experiences. And then there's also what I wrote more stuff down. Also, Pride by Rob Sanders is a nonfiction picture book for kind of the like 5 to 8 age range about the creation of the Pride flag. So those are like picture books. And then I had know some like YA books. Like I really like The Miseducation of Cameron Post. And I also have to mention the Percy Jackson series. That was really important to my like friend group and I when we were, up and coming queer middle school kids to have that representation. And then Simon versus the Homo sapien agenda, of course, which is the book that loved Simon, the movie is based on. Annie on My Mind.
Oh, I read that.
That one is
Good.
a lovely book. And then I have a couple that are they're like upper elementary, lower middle school, one is a drama, which is a graphic novel about a young girl questioning her sexuality and coming out. I also have Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World and The Misadventures of the Family Fletcher. These are all like really nice books kind of that are a little bit lower level than the YA fiction.
Yeah, thank you. You have I knew you would have like a lot of great things for kids and youth books because that's something you're interested in. Yeah, thank you so much. And also for like highlighting, the different levels and that there is the upper elementary, lower middle school that is kind of missing.
Exactly, because there's picture books. A lot of them are meant to be, read aloud with adults who can then answer questions that kids have, and then there's like gritty, dark YA fiction with a lot of tragedy and a lot of pain in it. And I wish that there was more in the middle.
Yeah.
But
I wanted to highlight one more that I just remembered the name of, which is Dreadnought, which is YA, and it is kind of dark and a little bit tragic, but the tragedies at the beginning, and then the characters get to grow from there, and the main character is a trans girl who accidentally inherits some superhero powers. And so it gets to be like whimsical and playful and empowering as well as serious and dark.
Yeah.
That sounds really amazing. I'll add that to my list to look at.
And for shows, I cannot believe this hasn't come up yet, but the film Pride, which is, I think, a British film about...
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's about these like gay punks in the 80s who travel from the city, I guess from London, to Wales to be on the picket line supporting coal miners who are striking, and who are phobic, and then they like learn to understand each other and get along, and it's all very lovely and like not mainly about queer topics, but most of the characters are very queer.
Awesome. I'll look that one up also.
Yeah, that one's great. So what do you wish that you had learned as a kid or youth about gender and sexuality that you didn't learn until later?
Gosh, I think I wish I'd learned and like earlier on like how fluid sexuality is, and then it can change, and for many folks it does change, and that's not a bad thing, that's not a negative thing, and that doesn't mean that that you're lying or that you don't know what you actually want, that's just something that's incredibly natural. It happens to a lot of folks and happens, over the course of a lifetime. And I think to myself and to many of my peers that would have been really important to know and would have saved us just a lot of negative self-talk, a lot of, hurt and inner turmoil to know that really early on. And then also, I think just like LGBT history and just the fact that LGBT queer and trans folks have existed throughout history would have been really important, and like would have been like really good for us in our like as we navigated the world, to know that like this didn't begin in like 2000. Like queer folks have existed forever. And
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I feel like we didn't learn a lot of that. I think that would be good. A lot of the history we learn in school it's very heteronormative. It's very white, very Western, and I think really need to move away from that.
Definitely. That's another thing also to learn about like gender identities that have existed outside the Western binary.
Yes.
And like decolonize your history.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So now I'd like to talk about some things particularly related to early childhood. So one question that I had for you is, as you know, one challenge with this work is that some people are fine with talking about LGBTQ teens, but they'll feel it's not appropriate or not relevant to talk about gender and sexuality with younger kids. And what would you say to them?
I would say that those ideas that really they need to be addressed by recognizing that LGBT identities are not inherently have hypersexualized and inappropriate, and LGBT folks exist in all walks of life at all ages, and that many folks start questioning when they're really young, and they go through years of you know not having any representation, not understanding their feelings and what they're why they don't conform to the heteronormative cisnormative standards. So I think just definitely just getting rid of the idea that LGBT identities are hypersexual and are somehow inappropriate for children, because it's if you can learn about heterosexual relationships, you can also learn about LGBT relationships and identities.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So also, I just want to open it up to you, to talk about anything with your work and your studies that you feel would be relevant,
Oh gosh.
It's kind of open-ended. I don't know if that's stressful, but like.
Oh god. Yeah, I'm really excited to be studying education and to bring my perspectives and my experiences and like my knowledge to the field of teaching, and to create more open and safe and affirming communities and classrooms. And that was not very eloquent, but I'm so excited. I love teaching and I love working with kids, and I love the idea of just creating an more expansive, more inclusive curriculum. I'm kind of a curriculum nerd, but I love like going through different curriculums and like thinking about like books that could be books and stories and activities that could be included, and whose voices aren't being and stories aren't being included in curriculum, and how do we change that in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. I often think I'm not being eloquent, but like you have important things to say.
Thank
So,
you.
you know, it's
Thank
okay.
you. Thank
Don't have to be eloquent all the
you.
time.
Yes.
So I do also want to discuss intersectionality within the queer and trans communities. And so I have two particular questions. But if there's anything else you'd like to say about intersectionality outside of that, definitely feel free to talk about that. So the first question that I wanted to ask you is about what particular barriers do queer and trans youth of color face, and what particular strengths and assets do they bring, and what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for queer and trans youth of color?
I think the first thing is to get rid of this idea that exists in many like white liberal queer circles that we can't be racist because we're queer. We absolutely we understand what people of color experience. There's no way we could be racist, right? When they're actually like incredibly racist and exclusive and microaggressive to queer and trans folks of color. So just first of all, just destroy that idea. Like that's not being queer is not, being white and queer is not, it doesn't mean you understand racism, you don't, and racial oppression. And then just to really like be open to addressing, your own racism, your own biases that exist within yourself and within your communities. And to also like this idea of like, oh, we're gonna bring these folks to the table, like to the proverbial table, as if like the table is yours and you're just, as if you own the table and you have this freedom to just like bring these folks in. Like that's that's not it. That's, what am I trying to say? That it's basically that you don't own these you don't own these spaces, and you're not bringing, you know like, oh, I'm so benevolent and kind, I'm bringing these people into these spaces, but actually like making these spaces open and welcoming spaces that folks of color want to be in and are safe in.
Yeah,
Thank you. I
thank
really
you.
appreciate that framing.
Definitely.
And something I've been thinking throughout these interviews, and especially with what you just said, is that so many white queers could use to be reminded that a lot of what we culture, or especially like mainstream gay culture, is actually Black drag queen culture,
Yes,
exactly.
or drag ball culture, right? That comes from a really
Exactly.
specific place and time and set of communities. And like, we need to be careful with how we like appreciate that, while also excluding the very people whose communities built it.
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely addressing appropriation in
yeah.
white queer communities too.
No, because I see a lot of erasure in that department. I see a lot of white queer people being like, "Oh, we queer people have ownership of that as a whole," but they're also, so not only are they erasing the origins, but they kind of mean white queer people. Like they don't really think a lot about queer people of color. It's just like there's kind of that like duality exists where they're like both appropriating and not
Yeah.
acknowledging and
Mm-hmm.
not welcoming the people whose culture this like really is.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely appropriation and erasure are two sides of the same ugly coin. That
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
yeah.
And I also wanted to ask, what particular barriers do disabled and or neurodivergent LGBTQ people face? And what particular strengths and assets do they bring? And what could adults in the community do to make it more welcoming for these youth?
That is another really, really great question. That definitely these spaces, well, a lot of queer spaces, while also being white, are also very centered on able-bodied folks, both, as in terms of physical access, emotional and mental access. to these spaces and who, who's represented in these spaces. So I think, and there's also a lot of, erasure of queer disabled folks, and what is the, what are the intersections of being queer and disabled like, and what do, when it comes to, say, like access to resources for queer disabled folks, that I think is a big issue. Say, like, for example, if you live in a rural area and you're openly queer and you're, also disabled, your only access to a doctor is a doctor who's unaccepting of your identity. What do you do? Because you have to have access to medical care. So I think really, like, addressing access to resources for disabled, and also both like physical health resources and also mental health resources is really important, and definitely something that adults should have on their agendas when working with disabled queer folks and disabled queer youth. And I think, and also just representation in these communities, and representation of queer disabled history, and the fact that along with able-bodied queer folks, queer disabled folks have existed for all time, and have been important in these communities.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Is there anything else that you would like to say about intersectionality?
I think another important part of intersectionality that a lot of folks don't address is class.
Yeah.
Socioeconomic class and class access, especially both in urban. There are unique challenges in urban and rural areas. I think one big challenge in these rural areas is, say, access to resources, because you don't have access to transportation. Like, for example, Outright Vermont is with their centers and their resources, is in Burlington. What if you live, what if you're poor youth, you don't have a car, you live 3 hours away from Burlington? You don't have access to those resources. So really getting access to resources, like, regardless of class, I think is really important. And just addressing the intersection of class, because I think we really like to talk about, obviously, race and gender and sexuality and ability, but class is often erased in those conversations. So I think just bringing it into the conversation, and like educating yourself and others about the importance of class as an intersection.
Yeah, no, we've talked about that in a couple of other interviews, but I think it's really important the way you're framing it, especially like how like class and gender and sexuality, those intersections, and how they work specifically in rural areas. Because you're the first person who's brought that up, and it is so important, because transportation is tied to where you are, and it's tied to class, and I feel like people tend to focus only on one of those aspects and not bring like both of them in.
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
all of those need to be addressed in order to have safe, affirming spaces for queer youth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think your point about transportation also makes me think about the social realities of rural places as well as geographic. So, like, say you are that low income rural queer youth and you have one friend who has a car. Find out you're queer and don't like you anymore, now you don't have access to the city anymore, right?
Exactly.
Or maybe they're queer too, and you go access those resources together, and that's all great, and then you break up, and then you don't have access to that anymore, right?
Exactly.
Sometimes that combination of lack of resources and just being in a small community can lead people to like feel pressured to stay in relationships, whether romantic or not, with people that are not that great for them, because there aren't that many other ways for them to access community.
Exactly. Yeah, that sense of, that fear of isolation is really real, and is a really real reality for a lot of queer rural youth. So I've definitely seen that play out, and really, like, experienced it myself where I'm like, I don't, these people aren't great, but I don't have anyone else who really understands me. So I guess I'm just going to stick with them because there isn't, otherwise isolation is my only other option.
Those are such great points. And I have felt that way, but I didn't like pinpoint it until now what that was. That is really important. Thank you both.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, because I feel like a lot of times our community in rural areas are like the other queer people that we know, which is often like a small group of people, and that may not end up being a group of people who is good for our mental health. There might be like conflicts there that aren't resolvable. There might be abusive relationships, but a lot of times when you don't have any other community that understands you, it's a lot harder to get away from that.
Exactly. And I think on the other end of that, I think the internet is it's an amazing resource for queer youth to be able to connect and find community. And it can also be, be dangerous if you're accessing folks who may not, have the best intentions and may get into unhealthy relationships with them. So there's a lot of it's on like both ends of the spectrum's not the word, but I'm going to say spectrum because I can't think of any other words. But
I have absolutely had both of those experiences, and that's such a good point. I think a lot of people talk about internet is great or internet is bad, and it's like it can be both. It really depends what you find.
Exactly. Yeah. If you don't have a safe, supportive, healthy community in real life, you can really be driven into some unhealthy communities that exist online.
Yeah,
we just had this moment that I don't think is going to show up on the recording, unfortunately, where when I said the thing about like, then you stay friends with people because they can connect you to community, right? And all three of us were like, oh, that.
Yes, that's the thing.
And that experience that we just had recognizing that together, that's a thing that queer and trans youth need from adults, right?
Definitely.
And I know I don't totally look it, but I'm about 20 years older than you two. And like, wouldn't it be cool if there were publicly out queer and trans adults who could be like, I think I see what might be going on with you. Like, you're not the only one. This is a thing that happens. We've all been through this, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, and that brings it back to just the importance of having access to queer adults and mentors. That a lot of queer youth are missing, especially in rural areas.
Another issue that I've faced, which we really don't like to talk about, but we should, is that when you seek out, sometimes you find what you think is a queer adult mentor and realize that you have actually found a queer adult who is going to prey on you because you are a vulnerable 18-year-old who is still trying to figure things out.
100%.
And it's so hard to talk about that because you feel like you're reinforcing like the predator stereotypes, which are totally untrue, but there are predators everywhere in any community, and it's so hard.
Yes, thank you. I'm so glad that you brought that up, Claire.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that happens with straight cis folks also.
Absolutely.
But can be so magnified for queer young people because of how that might be one of the only queer adults they've ever been in contact with.
Because like the need for queer adult role models means that you might not be as discerning about if somebody is a good person to be around and is going to be a mentor, is going to be a positive role, or if they're going to be manipulative, because you have like more of a need for that, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that happens everywhere, regardless of gender and sexuality, but I agree with you that it can have a particularly damaging impact on LGBTQ folks because, we have so few adult role models, and it's really...
Yeah. And for adults watching, I want to say that like the great majority of queer and trans adults have the very best intentions in connecting with youth. And it's important that we do connect with youth, because sometimes we also have this baggage of like not wanting to be seen as a creepy predator, even if that's not what we're doing, right? But we have to take that risk to form appropriate and supportive relationships. And also I'm reminded of the word that Jay used in a previous interview of possibility models, that I can't out being like, I'm your role model, you should be like me when you grew up. Like, no, I'm doing one possibility of how life can be, and you're gonna do some other ones, but like I want young folks to have lots of possibilities in mind, not just the one or two people that are out and live close to them.
I love that idea of possibility models, because I am actually becoming like, mainly like, I don't have a lot of close friends who are queer adults, but like I have some like mutual friends who are, and I've noticed there's a lot of different like lives they're leading, a lot of different relationship structures that they have, you know, and also, and it's like I am seeing like different like possibilities. And so I think it's important that people be seeing that from a younger age, because I mean, until I was somebody who was like on the internet, until I was somebody who was meeting a lot of people through college or, you know, through internet or various things, like I wasn't really seeing that. I also, you have already said some things about being in a rural area, but I just realized I didn't specifically ask a question about that, which I do want to. How might queer and trans youth in rural areas have different needs than in cities? And how can rural areas be supportive places for queer and trans youth and adults?
I think definitely that access to resources piece is one of the biggest pieces in rural areas, and that in urban areas there tend to be a lot more access to queer specific resources, whether it's, you know, healthcare resources, housing resources, like anti-violence programs, like sexual education, and also just affirming spaces. So I think really like addressing the need for material resources and like easy access to material resources for, you know, for queer adults and youth in rural areas. And I keep coming back to this transportation piece, but public transportation to actually be able to access these resources would change so many lives. I know we don't really have the ability to just build or you know, a light rail system here, but that transportation piece would like really, you know, as a young person before I was able to drive, like that sense of isolation and not having access to resources was really damaging for myself and, you know, for people, you know, other queer youth that I was friends with or knew. So I'm going to keep saying transportation and public transportation, but yeah, definitely resources and like just recognition that there are so many, you know, strong queer rural communities, because in so much of our media it's, you know, that, oh, I left, you know, I left this small town and I found the queer community in the city, and that, you know, it's an experience that a lot of people have, and that's valid, but there are a lot of really strong, you know, queer rural communities out there that are doing really incredible work and creating supportive communities together. And I think that recognition and that, you know, knowledge about those communities would also be really important, and the idea that you don't have to move to a city to be able to, you know, find a queer community or build one. You know, that you can, if you prefer to live in a rural area, you can do that. You know, as a queer youth, you don't automatically have to leave, you know, the area you grew up in or the area that you love living in.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a good point, because it is the big stereotype. It's like, oh, if you're queer, you gotta leave the small town, you gotta go to the city, and you're gonna have a great time and meet people. Because, like, you can find and make great queer communities in rural areas. Some people just don't like cities. Some people are just, like, that's not, like, where they want to live, and, like, that it doesn't have to be.
Exactly, and that we should also be supporting rural queer communities so that youth don't feel like they have to leave.
Yeah.
And that they can stay.
Also, I think we idealize cities in, like, particularly in media, the way that that's represented, and it's like not every city is going to be welcoming. Some of them are going to be overwhelming at first. And I think it's both the demonization of small towns and the idealization of big cities are both harmful narratives in different ways.
Exactly.
Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us?
Just want to say thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about all these things, and I'm really glad that I'll be a part of this education mission and, you know, helping to create better, more affirming spaces. So thank you both for that.